In a place designed for service and trust, a silent figure commands no attention, an elderly black man whose presence alone ignites invisible barriers. Surrounded by polished marble and fluorescent lights, the air thickens with unspoken rules and unseen walls built from suspicion and prejudice. This is a story where every cold glance, every calculated exclusion, slowly tightens like a noose, only to unravel with a revelation so powerful it shatters the illusion of control. What happens when the very person dismissed as invisible holds the key to exposing a system built on bias? Prepare for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about justice and power. If this story draws you in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation. Share your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice is part of this fight for dignity. The security guard nearby didn't rush to help. Instead, he eyed Leroy from a distance, slowly approached, and tapped the keypad before the door finally allowed entry. The moment felt longer than it was. Leroy nodded in appreciation, but the guard said nothing, just turned and walked away. The moment he stepped fully into the cool, marbled air of a lobby, Leroy felt something shift. A faint, familiar weight settled across his shoulders, the kind you can't see or name, but you know it when it arrives. The lobby was pristine, dressed in glass and light. A large chandelier glittered above the main floor, throwing fractured rays across polished stone. A few customers sat on cushioned benches waiting for service. Others stood near kiosks or at teller windows. Leroy glanced around, spotting the check-in kiosk near the receptionist desk. He made his way to it with quiet steps. He tapped the touchscreen to get his service ticket. A red flash blinked across the screen. Out of order. There was no follow-up message, no suggested alternative, no apology. He turned slightly, looked to the receptionist behind the counter. She was young, maybe 24. Her nails were long and glossy. She wore a tight ponytail and a wireless earpiece in one ear. She looked up at him, paused, then looked back down at her phone, scrolling. Leroy cleared his throat lightly. She glanced back up, frowning with slight impatience. "The kiosk isn't working," he said softly. She didn't nod or offer a solution. She just said, "Take a seat. They'll call you." Her tone was flat, clipped. He looked behind him. No one else was waiting. Still, he obeyed, walking calmly to the nearest chair by the window and sitting down with his notebook resting on his lap. The notebook was old, worn along the edges. Inside were handwritten notes, charts, and clippings, his records. Some of the contents had been there for years, others added just last week. Today wasn't just a visit. He wasn't there to deposit or withdraw. He was there for oversight. Just not yet. A man in a charcoal suit stepped through the doors. White, mid-40s, polished shoes. The kiosk lit up for him with a gentle blue screen. He tapped once. Received a number. The receptionist smiled brightly, rose from her seat, and walked around to greet him. "Right this way, sir." She led him to a private teller station in the back. Leroy turned slightly to observe it all. Still waiting. Another man came in, a mother with her child, 2 women in heels. All of them moved through with speed and ease. No kiosk error, no seating delay. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The seats around him filled and emptied in cycles. But no one called his name. No one asked his business. A male teller walked across the lobby and paused near Leroy's chair. He stared for a moment, then reached down and placed a small yellow, triangular sign at Leroy's feet. "Caution, wet floor." The floor beneath him was spotless. Leroy said nothing. The teller walked away. Soon after, a middle-aged woman in a silk blouse passed by, eyed the sign, and made a wide arc to avoid him. Another man with a briefcase glanced at the sign, then Leroy, then quickly changed direction and found another seat. Subtle movements. But their message was clear. A security guard, different from the first, began pacing the lobby. Tall, with a radio clipped to his shoulder and a habit of glancing over his mirrored sunglasses every few seconds. He stopped near Leroy, glanced down at the notebook in his lap, then walked on. He returned a few minutes later, slower, more deliberate. "Sir," he said, voice low but firm, "Are you waiting for someone?" Leroy nodded once. "For service." "You have an appointment?" "I was told to wait." "You've been sitting here a long time." Leroy looked him in the eye. "Yes." The guard lingered, unsure how to proceed. Then he nodded, but stayed standing within view. Leroy shifted in his seat. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt now was a steady tightness behind his ribs. The kind of pressure that builds when the shape of a place says, "You are not wanted here." He'd been in places like this before. Sometimes it was subtle, averted eyes, forced smiles, quiet exclusions. Other times it was louder, cruder. But the impact was the same. You feel it in your bones. A teller finally stepped out from a side hallway. She didn't call a name, just pointed to the woman next in line. The woman looked startled, then followed. Leroy stood, approached the counter, gently cleared his throat to be noticed. The teller glanced at him, startled, as if he had walked in uninvited. "Sir, please wait until you're called," she said. "The kiosk didn't give me a number," Leroy replied, keeping his voice low. "Then please check with the front desk," she replied without warmth. Leroy returned to the receptionist. She didn't look up until he spoke. "I still haven't been called." She barely lifted her gaze. "Like I said, just wait. No one else is waiting. We're on a system. You'll be called when it's your turn." Leroy didn't respond. He turned and walked slowly back to his seat. The yellow caution sign was gone now. In its place was a folded pamphlet on fraud prevention. It hadn't been there before. He sat down again, this time feeling the full weight of a silence. Time crawled. The people changed. The system remained. Somewhere in the distance, a door clicked open. The mechanical whir of the vent above him now seemed rhythmic, calculated, cruel. He glanced up and followed the narrow slant of the vent with his eyes. Behind the front desk, a young man in business attire finished speaking with the receptionist, adjusted his tie, and walked confidently toward a teller, bypassing Leroy without a glance. The receptionist laughed at something he'd said, warm, open laughter that had no place in the icy radius where Leroy sat. A soft click sounded nearby. A maintenance staff member emerged from a hidden side door, pushing a mop bucket and wearing a neon vest. Without making eye contact, he wheeled the bucket directly past Leroy's feet, dripping a trail of water that stopped just inches from the toes of Leroy's polished, weathered shoes. The man paused, glanced down, then turned and rolled the bucket away, leaving the small puddle behind like a forgotten insult. Leroy shifted slightly to the side, subtly moving his foot away from the encroaching moisture. He glanced around the room. Everyone else appeared untouched, comfortably settled in warmer pockets of space, sipping coffee, chatting softly, interacting as customers were meant to. No one seemed to notice him. Or perhaps they did, but had decided long ago that looking his way came with risk or discomfort. Whatever the reason, Leroy remained outside their attention, but squarely within their judgment. The next signal was even quieter. A woman in a burgundy pencil skirt walked past with a clipboard, glancing down the hallway before turning abruptly to reroute her path around Leroy's chair. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. She simply adjusted her approach, as if passing too close might trigger something unpleasant. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the floor, but skipped once, a momentary hitch, when she caught a glimpse of the red mark on Leroy's neck. The sound of those skip steps landed heavier than her entire stride. Behind the glass window at the receptionist station, a low conversation began. The receptionist leaned toward her colleague, shielding her mouth with her hand. Leroy caught fragments, quiet, casual words like loiter and watch him, spoken with the indifference of someone describing the weather. He didn't need to hear everything. He had learned to recognize tone over content, and tone had a language all its own. Her eyes darted toward him occasionally, quick, slicing glances like flick blades, assessing without engaging. After a while, the back office door opened again and a mid-level manager stepped into the lobby. He wore a tight-fitting blazer and carried a clipboard in one hand and a disposable coffee cup in the other. As he crossed the floor, he nodded politely to a couple seated near the front, paused to speak briefly to an older woman near the VIP line, then moved directly toward the receptionist's desk. The receptionist whispered something to him behind cupped hands. He looked over, barely hiding the glance in Leroy's direction. His expression didn't harden. It didn't have to. It simply tightened, like a man preparing to deal with something he found beneath the station. He walked slowly across the room, casually, sipping from his cup, then stopped near Leroy's chair without making eye contact. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, not saying a word, just watching the security monitor on the wall as if it held the answer to something unspoken. Then he turned and walked away, muttering something into the radio clipped to his hip. Moments later, the air vent above Leroy made a low, deliberate hum before the breeze intensified. Still, Leroy remained still. The birthmark on his neck, exposed just slightly beneath the collar, flushed darker from the cold. But he ignored it. He focused instead on the way people walked past him, faster, with slightly larger strides, as if their instinct told them he might rise at any moment and become a problem. They didn't know him, but somehow they had all decided who he was, and he had seen that decision made more times than he could count. He adjusted the notebook on his lap. The leather had darkened slightly with age, but the edges were still crisp where he'd trimmed the phrase by hand. Inside were documents stamped with insignias most bank employees wouldn't recognize, forms and reports signed by agency heads whose names didn't appear on standard office memos. None of that mattered here. Not yet. Because right now, to them, he was only an old man sitting too long in one place. A nuisance. A question that made the room uneasy. Eventually, a young woman, clearly new, judging by the way she hesitated with each step, walked across the lobby with a stack of folders. She paused near the reception desk. The receptionist leaned close, whispered something, and pointed discreetly in Leroy's direction. The young woman gave a quick nod, then walked toward the far end of the teller counters, keeping her back toward him the entire time. When she disappeared behind a corner, the receptionist pulled out a laminated sign and taped it to the side of her desk facing Leroy's seat. It read, "Scheduled cleaning in progress area closed." No mop, no equipment, no staff, just the sign, as if that alone would be enough to nudge him away. And perhaps it would have if Leroy hadn't learned long ago the power of staying seated, of letting silence speak longer than noise. So he remained. He didn't speak, didn't react. He simply rerouted his body like water flowing around stone. But the gesture left a mark, not on the polished floor, but in the invisible architecture of judgment surrounding him. The two women had seen the whole thing. Both wore tailored coats and carried designer handbags, their nails immaculate, expressions polished. One had stepped up to the ATM first, tapping the screen with practiced familiarity, while the other adjusted her sunglasses atop her head. As Leroy settled into the second chair, a faint smell of citrus cleaner lingered in the air, a deception, because no one had mopped or scrubbed. The smell came from a rag the employee had carried in his pocket, used only to fake the atmosphere of sanitization. The women whispered to each other, glancing sideways. Then, as if silently agreeing to some unspoken threat, they picked up their receipts, clutched their bags tighter, and walked briskly to the premium client lounge on the far end of the lobby. Their withdrawal was not about fear, not really. It was performance, calculated, habitual, the way people adjust their comfort zones when someone doesn't fit their expectations. Leroy saw it, but didn't follow them with his gaze. Instead, he looked straight ahead, focusing on a framed mission statement that hung crooked above the central counter. The words on the poster spoke of inclusion, community trust, service for all. The irony hovered there like dust in the sunlight. A man in a pressed vest and striped tie stepped from the manager's office and paced slowly along the front counter. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, not even the customers. When he reached the reception area, he leaned in to say something to the young woman behind the desk. She nodded once, then discreetly pointed in Leroy's direction. The man turned his head a fraction, enough to glance at the older gentleman sitting quietly beneath the air vent, then resumed walking with his hands folded behind his back. He circled the lobby as if inspecting it for flaws, but his real focus was clear. His route formed a slow loop around Leroy, close enough to monitor, far enough to feign indifference. The next moment unfolded with eerie familiarity. A child, perhaps 7 or 8, broke from his mother's grip and walked over to Leroy, his eyes curious, innocent. He stared at Leroy's notebook, which rested again in his lap. The boy reached out a hand, pointing at the cover. Before he could speak, his mother rushed forward, snatched his hand, and whispered something sharp and urgent into his ear. Her eyes flicked toward Leroy, not with anger, but discomfort, as if she had walked into something wrong. She pulled the boy away, so quickly his sneakers squeaked against the tile. She didn't look back. The mother's reaction drew more attention than the child's curiosity. Several heads turned. Eyes darted. A low hum of murmurs stirred the air like static. One of the women in the premium lounge stood from her seat, walked to the front desk, and said something in a tone too low to hear. The receptionist glanced over, nodded once, then typed something into the keyboard. A few seconds later, a soft chime rang from the overhead speakers. No words, just a chime, neutral, unattached to any call or announcement, but timed with precision. Leroy recognized it. A signal internal, meant for staff, not customers. He had heard similar codes before in buildings, not unlike this one. They always meant the same thing: alert without escalation, prepare without confrontation, watch without accusation. The notebook on his lap remained closed. His hands stayed still, folded over one another. But inside, his heart had begun to press harder against his chest. Not fear, not surprise, just pressure. The kind that comes when 1,000 small signs converge into one massive, quiet wall you can't climb or break through. A line of silent judgment drawn not in words, but in glances, body language, and signals disguised as routine. A tall man wearing a concierge badge approached slowly, holding a silver tray with cups of water. He stopped near a young couple across the room, offered them each a cup, then looked toward Leroy. His eyebrows lifted, then lowered again. He turned, walked back the way he came, tray still full, skipping the one man sitting alone in the lobby who had been waiting the longest. The silence pressed heavier now. A few people tapped at their phones. Some glanced at the security camera above the entrance. The receptionist picked up her phone and spoke into it quietly. The vent above Leroy adjusted with a low mechanical click, and the temperature around him dropped a few more degrees. It wasn't a coincidence. Another staff member, this one older, with gray streaks in her bun, walked past and dropped a stack of brochures on a nearby table. Her eyes slid toward Leroy as she passed, expression unreadable. One of the brochures fluttered off the table and landed near his foot. He bent slowly, picked it up, and placed it back on the pile. She was already gone. Leroy closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Behind them, he saw again the long, slow erosion that people like him knew too well. Not fire, not knives, not curses, just silence weaponized. Clean spaces used as barriers. Warm tones reserved for others. Suspicion coded into every friendly gesture that stopped short of including him. And always, always, that endless parade of signs. Not literal ones. The other kind. The kind you can't prove, but can't ignore. It had prompted Leroy to rise slowly, clutching his notebook, his back slightly stiffer now from the chill and long wait. But 3 steps into the walk, the young man turned, muttered something into a headset, tapped the touchscreen beneath the counter, and instantly the monitor blinked. Closed. See front desk. The lights above the counter dimmed. He was gone before Leroy even reached the edge of the desk. Leroy paused, glancing at the screen, then slowly turned his gaze toward the receptionist, who now appeared conveniently busy with another customer. The message from the ceiling speaker echoed again, as if mocking him in pristine corporate optimism. "We are honored to serve you." The phrase repeated every few minutes like a drip from a leaking faucet. Polite, sterile, and unbearable. Leroy didn't go back to his seat. He stood still for a moment, gathering what little was left of his dignity from the cracks in the marble floor, then turned calmly and made his way to the reception counter. He waited behind the velvet rope for nearly 2 full minutes as the receptionist scrolled her phone behind the screen of her monitor, only raising her eyes once to glance at him, and then again to pretend she hadn't. When she finally acknowledged him, she didn't say a word. She simply lifted her chin in a silent, "What?" expression and tilted her head to the side. Leroy stepped forward, trying to keep his voice low and even. "I was just called to counter 3, he said, holding the notebook slightly higher, as if it might lend weight to his words. "But the counter was closed as I arrived." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, gave a single slow blink, then looked at her monitor. Her fingers tapped keys without urgency. After a few seconds, she said, flatly, "That counter's not taking walk-ins." Leroy opened his mouth, then closed it. The mental calculation was instant. If he protested, he would be labeled difficult. If he insisted, someone would call security. If he raised his voice even slightly, they would point to the cameras. The game was rigged. He knew that. Instead, he simply asked, "Then where should I go?" "Take a seat," she said, already turning away. "Someone will call you." He stepped back, slowly, deliberately, as though walking through molasses. His shoes made no sound on the marble. The notebook in his hand felt heavier. The line behind him shifted forward without pause, and the next customer smiled brightly at the receptionist, received a cheerful greeting, and was escorted to counter 5 within seconds. Leroy didn't return to his original seat this time. He moved toward a bench near the center of the lobby, further away from the entrance, where the light was duller and the air colder. The vent above him hummed, reacting almost instantly to his presence, like it had been waiting. He sat down with a quiet sigh, careful not to let the sound become more than a breath. Around him, the motion of the bank continued, bustling, seamless, exclusionary. At the far end of the room, a man in a gray suit adjusted his tie while talking loudly on a Bluetooth headset. He laughed, ran a hand through his hair, and gestured dramatically toward a group of bankers at the corner office. A woman in a green dress sat near the coffee stand, sipping from a branded cup, scrolling her phone, periodically glancing up and giving nervous smiles to everyone except Leroy. Then came the second act of dismissal. A man in a maintenance uniform emerged from a utility door holding a tray with 2 small boxes, sanitizing wipes and aerosol spray. He didn't approach anyone else. Instead, he walked toward Leroy's previous chair, the one near the window now empty. He sprayed the cushion generously, wiped it down with slow, exaggerated strokes, then looked over at Leroy as if to say, "Clean now," before walking away. Leroy didn't move. He didn't acknowledge the gesture. He simply sat where he was, taking in the full scale of dismissal. The bank, in all its refined cruelty, was quietly clearing him out, without ever touching him, without ever raising a voice, without saying a single thing that could be repeated or proven. It was all suggestion, posture, implication. And it worked. He felt it not just in his body, but in his spirit. That tightening of space around you, the growing awareness that you don't belong, that the room is closing in while pretending to open. It wasn't the first time, but that didn't make it easier. A small girl ran across the lobby chasing a dropped toy. She rolled past Leroy's feet, reached down to grab the toy dinosaur, and looked up. For a moment, their eyes met. Then her father called her sharply from across the lobby, and she ran back without a word. The father cast a quick glance toward Leroy and shifted positions, placing himself between his child and the bench. The notebook in Leroy's lap tilted slightly. He adjusted it with both hands, as though to keep it steady. Inside, credentials waited, sealed files, a letter of federal assignment. But still, he remained silent. He had his reasons. But now the patterns were beginning to tighten. The casual cruelty that had started with indifferent glances and silent refusal began morphing into something more deliberate, more structured, as if a collective decision had been made not only to exclude him, but to make him feel that exclusion in a tangible, undeniable way. It began with the guard again, the same one from earlier, broad-shouldered, with tight sleeves and a deep crease between his brows, approached not with aggression, but with a calm, measured pace. He didn't ask questions this time. He didn't bother with fake politeness. He simply looked down at Leroy's notebook, then reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a red laminated tag. The tag read, "Unidentified item, hold for review." Without speaking, he reached forward and placed the tag directly on top of the notebook, pressing it slightly as if to make sure Leroy felt the contact. Then he gave a single nod and walked away without explanation. Leroy didn't stop him. He didn't touch the tag. He simply stared at it for a long moment, registering the absurdity. The notebook had never left his hands until just a minute ago, placed beside him in plain sight. Yet now, marked as suspicious, it became another tool in the narrative being quietly constructed around him. The people nearby didn't question the guard's action. One woman in a gray pantsuit glanced over and immediately picked up her purse from the floor, setting it on her lap. A man behind her leaned slightly away from the bench, eyeing the notebook like it might contain something dangerous. The judgment, already present, sharpened its edges. Leroy saw it take shape in real time, the shift from unease to speculation, from speculation to imagined threat. That was the genius of it. No confrontation necessary, no words exchanged, just signs, symbols, and gestures that transformed a man into a shadow of risk. A few minutes later, a young intern emerged from behind the glass wall of the manager's office, holding a clipboard and a small silver badge clipped to her belt loop. She was probably no older than 20, still unsure of herself, but trained well enough to follow protocol. She approached a workstation near the main floor and tapped a screen that controlled the security cameras. Leroy's eyes followed her fingers. With a few subtle motions, she shifted the central camera's angle until it was fixed directly on his position. The mechanical whir was quiet, but unmistakable. A faint click confirmed its lock. Leroy didn't look up at the camera. He didn't need to. He had been monitored before. It wasn't the surveillance itself that struck him. It was the confidence of the action, the knowledge that no one would challenge it, that he couldn't challenge it. Next came the clipboard. Another employee, this one older with thinning hair and a banker's badge, walked the floor with a neutral expression, pausing to check each table and counter, nodding occasionally at clients and exchanging brief, mechanical smiles. When he reached Leroy's bench, he stopped, looked at the notebook, then at Leroy, and wrote something on the clipboard. He didn't ask a question. He didn't introduce himself. He simply made a notation and continued his circuit like a health inspector logging a potential code violation. The tag on the notebook remained in place, its red plastic corners curling slightly upward, catching the light in a way that seemed designed to draw attention. Leroy remained silent. His hands rested on his knees now, palms open, posture composed but weary. The room had begun to narrow again. Movement around him slowed as people began to take notice. A father near the teller line whispered something to his teenage son and nodded subtly toward Leroy's direction. The boy looked, frowned, and then they both stepped out of a line and exited through the side door, their transaction apparently less important than avoiding whatever had just been marked unidentified. Overhead, the speaker chimed again. This time, there was a message attached. Security personnel, please confirm zone status on lobby sector B. The voice was automated, sterile, and rang through the high ceilings with a manufactured sense of calm. Everyone heard it. Some looked up, others pretended not to, but everyone registered it. Sector B was where Leroy sat. The receptionist continued her work unbothered. Her smile reappeared for the next customer, a young couple in casual, who joked about interest rates. They received VIP tokens. Leroy, by contrast, received a signal he wasn't supposed to interpret, but clearly was meant to absorb. The line had moved from passive erasure to orchestrated exclusion. And worse, it was no longer just ignoring him. It was now creating a file, a story, a justification in case someone needed one later. A man in a gray security polo passed by once more, this time slower, pausing at the base of the bench. He pretended to check a nearby plug socket, then adjusted the leg of the bench slightly, tilting it half an inch off balance, just enough to make it uncomfortable. Leroy noticed, but said nothing. He shifted his weight subtly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of movement. Then came the final insult of the hour. A digital monitor mounted to the wall near the reception desk flickered, updated its queue list, and displayed a new message beneath the standard advertisements for low-interest home loans and secure savings accounts. The message read, "Notice, Please be aware of unattended belongings. Report suspicious behavior to staff immediately. The text remained on screen longer than any other slide. Leroy's reflection caught in the glossy surface. There he was, still quiet marked. He reached for the notebook now, lifted the red tag slowly, and folded it once, tucking it between the pages before closing the cover again. His movement was careful, composed. There was no defiance in it, only resolve. He set the notebook back on his lap and folded his hands over it. The temperature in the lobby dropped another degree. He had become part of their system now, not as a client, but as an anomaly, something to monitor, something to contain. But the next escalation wouldn't be silent. It would be slow, deliberate, and disguised as professionalism. It began with a mistake that wasn't a mistake. A tall, young employee wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard approached with a forced, courteous smile. He had an earpiece jammed into one ear and a laminated badge that read Customer Assistance Team Logan. He stopped precisely 4 feet from Leroy's bench and lowered his clipboard with theatrical care. "Sir," he said, voice neutral but loud enough for others to hear, "we've received some concerns from other clients regarding seating capacity. I'll need to ask if you're currently conducting business here, or," he left the sentence open, "hanging, a weapon disguised as inquiry." Leroy looked up slowly, eyes level, his voice low and steady. "I've been waiting to be called. No one has called me." Logan hesitated, flipping his clipboard around like it held answers. "Unfortunately, without a check-in number or visible appointment, it's hard for us to validate your status. If you could return another time or speak with someone at the front desk." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every word had been chosen to sound helpful. Every sentence was coded in the language of policy. But the message was clear: you're not wanted here. Leroy didn't rise. He didn't protest. He simply pointed one long finger at the small kiosk near the entrance. "The machine was out of order when I came in," he said. "I was told to sit and wait." Logan smiled again, tight and rehearsed. "Understood. Let me confirm something," he said, and turned on his heel, heading directly toward the receptionist, who had clearly seen and heard everything. Leroy watched as they exchanged whispers, glances, and gestures. Logan pointed once. The receptionist shrugged. Then Logan nodded and disappeared into the staff corridor behind the teller counters. Moments later, a new staff member emerged. This one wore a maintenance badge, but not the same as the earlier crew. He held a rolling bin stacked with yellow ropes and orange cones, the kind used to block off large sections of public space. Without saying a word, he walked toward the corner of the lobby where Leroy sat and began placing cones around the benches. First the one directly across from Leroy, then the one to his left, and finally a rope along the perimeter that boxed him into a wedge of cold air and polished tile. He never looked at Leroy. He just worked around him, creating a barrier that no one had asked for. The cones bore black lettering, "Restricted due to maintenance." But no one mopped, no one cleaned. There was no equipment, no cautionary scent of chemical cleaner. It was theater, set design for a narrative of exclusion. Customers now had to walk around the cones, avoiding the boxed-in area. Some muttered. Some glanced at Leroy. No one approached. From the outside, the setup resembled a safety measure. Inside the barrier, it felt like a cage. The message was unmistakable. You are a problem. You are contamination. And this is our solution. A woman holding a document folder approached a teller, then pointed toward the corner with narrowed eyes. The teller responded with a whisper and a nervous smile. A man across the room snapped a photo with his phone, pretending to be checking messages. The flash was off, but the angle was deliberate. Leroy saw it happen and turned his face slowly away, not in shame, but in preservation. Some truths don't need confrontation. They need to be endured. Then came the final blow of the hour. Logan returned, this time with a different tone. He was still smiling, but his body language had shifted. Shoulders straighter, voice louder, stance firmer. "Mr. Vance," he said, calling Leroy's name for the first time, though Leroy had never given it. "Unfortunately, I've been informed that we're unable to proceed with your service today. Due to internal scheduling changes and a system-wide delay, we'll need you to reschedule your visit at another time." He paused. "We can provide a number you can call for priority handling." Leroy blinked once. "You knew my name," he said. "Yes," Logan replied quickly. "We looked into our visitor registry during verification. It's part of our safety procedure." "So," Leroy asked, "you know who I am, but still no one came to speak with me until now." Logan didn't answer. He extended a card toward Leroy. "Please take this. Call the number. We'll make sure you're prioritized." The card trembled slightly in Logan's fingers. Leroy didn't take it. He looked down at his notebook, still resting on his lap, the red tag now tucked inside, glowing like a warning that had sunk into the paper. Then Logan added, "We'd also ask that you clear this area so we can restore full seating capacity to our other clients." A request delivered in gentle tones, but weighted like a shove. People around them watched openly now, unashamed. The drama had evolved into performance. They were waiting for a resolution. Leroy stared at the card. He thought of the words earlier. "We are honored to serve you." He rose slowly, movements deliberate, not rushed. He placed the notebook back into his coat pocket and looked at Logan, then at the cameras, then finally at the cones and ropes encircling the space. He reached for nothing. He explained nothing. He simply adjusted the collar of his shirt, turned his body to the open aisle, and walked to the reception counter one more time. He pulled out a sleek, black smartphone, its screen lighting up with a new message. "Proceed with caution. Immediate support en route." The sender was unknown to anyone in the bank, but known intimately to him. An internal contact within the federal oversight agency he worked for, a reminder that the quiet war he faced was far from over. Leroy's fingers trembled slightly as he tucked the phone away, but his face remained calm, composed. His steps toward the exit slowed. Something told him the moment to reveal the truth was near. He paused in front of the glass doors, looking out into the street where the world continued unaware. Traffic moved steadily. People hurried past in their own invisible struggles. He adjusted his coat collar again, feeling the familiar weight of the titanium wristband partially hidden beneath his sleeve. The same band that bore the insignia of his true authority, Inspector General Federal Reserve Internal Oversight. No longer was he just a man ignored or dismissed. No longer was he simply a target of silent judgment and orchestrated exclusion. The very institution that had relegated him to invisibility had no idea who was in their midst. As he stepped outside, two black SUVs with tinted windows rolled smoothly to the curb, engines idling quietly. From the passenger side of the lead vehicle, two men in dark suits emerged. Their faces were impassive, trained in years of government service. They approached Leroy without hesitation, nodding respectfully. The taller of the two handed him a folder sealed with the Federal Eagle, stamped confidential immediate investigation. Leroy accepted it without a word, feeling the final seal of authority settle on the moment. Back inside the bank, the receptionist's face paled when she noticed the vehicles parked outside. She glanced nervously toward the manager's office, where a group of employees had gathered, whispering urgently. A call had been made, quiet, precise, unavoidable. In the lobby, security guards straightened their stance. Staff who had previously skirted around Leroy now watched the scene with anxious eyes. The delicate veil of casual indifference began to tear as whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs edged toward open concern. A man in a crisp suit stepped out of the manager's office and approached the front desk with hurried steps. His expression was tight, eyes flicking toward the entrance. A bank official, a middle-aged woman with sharp features, appeared behind the desk and began typing rapidly into a terminal. Leroy's colleagues from the oversight agency moved swiftly. Cameras followed their every step. Their badges gleamed beneath the lobby lights, and their voices, though low, carried an unmistakable authority. The bank's polished facade was beginning to crack. In a quiet corner, the mother who had earlier pulled her child away looked on, her expression unreadable. A well-dressed couple who had avoided the area whispered among themselves, their conversation hushed but heavy with realization. A shift was occurring, not just in the bank's treatment of Leroy, but in the awareness of everyone present. Leroy stood tall now, no longer shrinking beneath the weight of exclusion. His eyes swept across the lobby, taking in the faces of those who had judged, ignored, or dismissed him. There was no anger, only a steady calm that demanded recognition. The notebook, once marked with suspicion, was now firmly in his grasp, a symbol of truth and authority. The security cameras angled toward the entrance captured every moment as the federal team began their inspection. Their presence was a reminder that oversight was not just a concept, but a force capable of piercing even the thickest walls of silence. The bank manager was summoned from his office. His face was pale, but forced a tight smile as he approached the team. A firm handshake was exchanged, but the eyes told a different story, one of mounting pressure and inevitable accountability. Leroy spoke only once, his voice low but clear enough to carry across the room. He identified himself as the federal inspector assigned to review the bank's internal practices. The reaction was instantaneous. Some staff looked stunned, others avoided his gaze, and the security personnel straightened reflexively. Throughout the lobby, the subtle undercurrent of judgment that had once defined Leroy's visit shifted. Whispers of recognition replaced murmurs of suspicion. Apologies were exchanged quietly, but the damage had been done. The facade of exclusivity and silent exclusion was being dismantled piece by piece. Outside, news crews began to gather, alerted by the unusual presence of federal agents. The building that once stood as a fortress of privilege was now under public scrutiny. Cameras flashed through the lobby's grand windows, capturing the unfolding scene as a story of justice and reckoning. Leroy remained composed amidst the chaos, his mission clear. The notebook he carried held evidence, reports, and documents that would unravel more than just this one incident. It was a fight for fairness, for transparency, and for the dignity denied to him and countless others. As the agents proceeded with their inquiry, Leroy allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead was long, but today marked a decisive turn. The silent judgment that had suffocated him was now confronted with its own exposure. But now, under the scrutinizing eyes of the agents, it became more than a mere blemish. It was a symbol, an unexpected beacon in a sea of shadows where prejudice had lurked unseen. One of the agents approached with a small ultraviolet scanning device, sleek and handheld. Without hesitation, Leroy extended his neck, lifting the collar of his shirt just enough to expose the birthmark fully. The agent slowly passed the device over the skin, watching as the mark fluoresced under the UV light, revealing an embedded microchip, a high-level federal security clearance embedded beneath the skin, a technology few knew existed except those in the highest tiers of oversight. The room seemed to hold its breath. The receptionist, who had been cautiously observing the proceedings from behind her desk, pressed her fingers to her lips in a silent gasp. The manager's face paled visibly, his earlier bravado now dissolved into stunned silence. Cameras fixed on Leroy zoomed in closer, capturing the detail of the birthmark glowing faintly under the scanning light. This was no ordinary customer. This was someone with power and authority beyond what the bank staff had reckoned with. As the agents began accessing secure terminals, cross-referencing internal databases, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted palpably. The subtle currents of suspicion that had once flowed only in whispers now swirled openly, carried on the tension of exposure. A bank teller who had earlier ignored Leroy stepped forward tentatively, whispering an apology before retreating back into the shadows. The woman who had once avoided his presence now watched silently from across the room, hands folded tightly in front of her, the weight of recognition settling heavily on her shoulders. Outside, a dark, unmarked van pulled up discreetly, but with unmistakable federal markings on its side. Two additional agents stepped out, their expressions stern but professional, moving swiftly into the building to join their colleagues. The federal inspection had expanded. As the agents accessed the bank's security logs, they uncovered video footage that recorded the treatment Leroy had endured. The false signs, the redirected air vents, the exclusion from service counters, the red tag on his notebook, and the slow orchestration of his isolation. Each frame of footage was time-stamped and cataloged, another piece in a growing mosaic of institutional misconduct. A hush fell over the gathered staff as the manager was called again to the front desk, this time to answer pointed questions. The stress etched lines deeper into his face. He offered explanations that faltered under scrutiny, unable to justify the systemic actions now laid bare. Meanwhile, Leroy remained steady, his notebook now open to reveal pages of detailed reports, investigations, and correspondence. These were not merely academic documents, but tools of accountability that he wielded with quiet determination. The birthmark on his neck, once a source of vulnerability, now symbolized resilience and authority. It shone like a beacon amid the unfolding reckoning. The bank's polished floors no longer felt like a stage for exclusion, but the setting for confrontation and change. The media, alerted to the federal presence, began arriving outside. Cameras rolled, reporters whispered into microphones, and the building became a focal point for a story that transcended a single man's experience. Leroy stood surrounded not only by agents and staff, but also by the palpable hope of reform. He understood the weight of the moment. The initial shock among bank employees turned into a collective unease. Whispered conversations multiplied into hushed meetings behind closed doors, their secrecy betraying the gravity of what was unfolding. The manager, who had once worn a forced smile, now sat rigidly in his office, flanked by senior staff. As the federal oversight team presented sealed orders stamped with the emblem of the Treasury Department and the authority of the Inspector General. Outside the bank, the black SUVs that had quietly arrived minutes before now formed a small convoy, their dark windows reflecting flashing police lights and the increasing number of media vans converging on the location. News crews began broadcasting live feeds, the story quickly escalating from an obscure customer complaint to a full-blown federal investigation into alleged discrimination and operational misconduct within a major financial institution. Inside the bank, security personnel were mobilized to restrict access to certain areas, turning the lobby into a controlled zone, while agents meticulously gathered evidence, from surveillance footage to employee statements, documenting every detail of the subtle but systematic exclusion Leroy had endured. Across the room, customers who had once glanced away with judgment or discomfort now watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, the spectacle transforming the space into a courtroom without walls. Staff members who had engaged in or tacitly permitted the discriminatory actions found themselves under increasing scrutiny. Some lowered their eyes, others exchanged nervous glances, while a few attempted to explain their behavior as adherence to protocol, though their voices faltered under the weight of federal oversight. Meanwhile, Leroy maintained his calm composure, a pillar of steady resolve amid the growing turbulence. His notebook, once a symbol of suspicion, now served as a trove of documentation validating his authority and the legitimacy of the investigation. The federal agents coordinated seamlessly, communicating through discreet earpieces, synchronizing interviews and evidence collection with precision. As the day progressed, a ripple effect began beyond the confines of this single branch. Reports surfaced indicating that other branches within the same financial network were under review, prompted by a cascade of complaints and insider reports triggered by the investigation in this lobby. An internal memorandum circulated, instructing regional managers to conduct self-audits and prepare for increased regulatory examinations. The narrative had moved beyond Leroy's personal experience into a systemic challenge, shining a light on ingrained practices that had quietly perpetuated exclusion and bias. The bank's corporate office issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the federal inquiry and promising full cooperation, but the damage was unmistakable. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the Pembroke Financial Trust building as Leroy Vance stepped out of the bank for the last time that day. The air outside was cool but no longer biting, carrying a sense of calm that belied the storm that had unfolded within those walls. News cameras still crowded the curbside, capturing his every movement, while reporters murmured questions to one another, waiting for a soundbite or a statement that would sum up the day's events. Leroy said nothing to them, merely adjusting the collar of his shirt and walking steadily away, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. The federal agents who had accompanied him during the inspection lingered nearby, their presence a silent reminder that this was more than a single confrontation. It was a call for change. Behind him, the bank's glass doors reflected the growing crowd of curious onlookers, many clutching phones that recorded and shared the moment, turning a quiet man's ordeal into a viral symbol of resilience and justice. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Where once there had been avoidance, whispers, and subtle exclusion, now there was a hushed reverence, as if the space itself acknowledged the weight of what had happened. Employees who had once looked away now shared uneasy glances with one another, burdened by the knowledge that their actions had been exposed and that change was inevitable. The bank had already issued a formal apology, its corporate statement circulating widely, promising to overhaul policies, implement new training, and ensure no customer would again be subjected to silent dismissal. But the real impact extended far beyond press releases and internal memos. Advocacy groups seized the moment to push for legislation, financial watchdogs initiated inquiries, and communities long marginalized saw in Leroy's experience a reflection of their own struggles and the hope that institutions could be held accountable. The scar on Leroy's neck, once a quiet mark of personal history, had become a beacon. It symbolized not just his authority as a federal inspector, but the scars many carried unseen, wounds inflicted by prejudice, exclusion, and systemic injustice. In the days that followed, Leroy continued his work, not as a lone figure confronting a single bank, but as part of a broader movement seeking transparency and fairness in the financial system. His story became a touchstone, cited in meetings, training sessions, and policy discussions. It was a reminder that dignity cannot be assumed. It must be demanded and protected. Walking away from the bank that evening, Leroy understood that his journey was far from over. The battles against bias, discrimination, and silent exclusion were fought every day, in every institution, in countless unseen ways. But today had marked a turning point, a moment when silence was broken, and the truth shone brightly enough to spark change. The final lesson was clear. Justice is not just about exposure, but about transformation. It requires courage, persistence, and the willingness to stand firm even when the world tries to render you invisible. And sometimes, the smallest acts of endurance, the refusal to leave a seat, the quiet assertion of one's presence, can unravel the strongest walls of indifference. The sun dipped below the horizon as Leroy disappeared into the city streets, carrying with him not only the weight of a federal badge, but the unshakable conviction that every human deserves to be seen, heard, and valued. The bank behind him stood as a testament to that truth, a place forever changed by the courage of one man who refused to be ignored. The end. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking and subscribing to stay updated on more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Leroy's journey resonated most with you? Also, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback and support mean a lot as we continue sharing stories that matter.